Welcome everyone. Today we are happy to present Jake Forbes, Creative Director at Star Stable Entertainment. Also have been working with Star Stable Online and also with a kind of like sneaky project called Project Career right now. So welcome, Jake. So nice to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, so I've been at Star Stable for 5 years. Actually, last week was my 5th anniversary with the company. I came in originally to start a new project that was kind of under wraps. The company wanted to do another MMO 5 years ago, but they decided it wasn't quite time for that. And so I transferred over to work on Star Stable as a narrative director and kind of interim creative director. So I wrote pretty much all of the text that went into Star Stable for the players for about 3 years. So all the story quests, all the descriptions, and I was very just hands-on as a writer and working with the designers on how to create experiences. As a living game, Star Stable has been running for over 10 years now. It's a really fun way to be a storyteller because you're constantly trying to create a welcoming environment for new players coming in, but also trying to kind of cater to people who have been living with this game in this world and this fiction for years. And especially with Star Stable's audience being 8 to 18, which is a pretty broad age range. You don't see a lot of games that are both kids and teens and older. I mean, people take it with them into adulthood because in a lot of ways it is the biggest horse game around. But you see people growing up with the game, and so their sensibilities change, and we try to change with them, but without alienating new young people coming in. So it was a really exciting and fun project to work on. And then about a year and a half ago, we kind of dusted off the old project that originally I was brought in to work on. And so it's currently just code name is Project Curie. We've been in development and pre-production for about a year now. And so I can't really talk about that game at this point, but it's just exciting to be able to contribute to an extension of building story-based worlds for underserved audiences. Being able to start on something from a kind of a clean slate has been another really dream job. So yeah, happy to be here and looking forward to talking to you all.
Great, thank you, Jake. So I think we can start with the presentation now. You're good to go, Jake.
Okay, so the subject of my talk is the future of games is fan fiction. Enduring stories transcend the context in which they were told. I mean, classics are classics for a reason, right? There's some objective canon of worthy titles that are like they maintain their relevance. And if you want to be well-read or you want to be informed and part of the discourse, those are the books you have to read. Those are the stories that matter, right? Well, that's kind of gatekeepy. So maybe there's a better way to look at it. So you could say that stories endure when they transcend the context in which they were told. So a vital discourse where people are engaging with the story, not just consuming, not just critiquing, but also participating in the storytelling process is a key part of why stories matter and why they endure. We see it in fandom and in both in academia and now in pop culture. We call this the discourse. So a vital discourse is what keeps works relevant. We see it in myths and folklore and stories that were passed down through the oral tradition, where tellers embellish their tales or fill in the bits that they couldn't remember. The stories get adjusted for new audiences where you add relevancy and try different media. And I mean, we see this continuing today with some of the classics from myths and folklore. And then one form of discourse is criticism, like the heated commentary on craft and aesthetics and the merits of fiction. And this goes back at least as far as Aristotle in the 4th century BC, but there were probably critiques of Gilgamesh back in cuneiform that got lost. And the discourse hasn't slowed down since then. Everybody has opinions, and opinions is a way to participate in the story process. Another form of discourse is the transformative work. So a transformative work it takes something extant and turns it into something new with a new purpose, new sensibility or new mode of expression. So we see this a lot with things that are in the public domain, where like a beloved story gets reinterpreted in new media. And sometimes it might be a very kind of traditional retelling. Like I really love this, one of the early Apple self-published game. They did a version of Alice in Wonderland. Amazing product design from Apple in the very, very early days. But it's a pretty conventional retelling of a story. But you also get people who use the theme and apply it in new ways. Or applying a very distinct vision that's very different from the original intent. Or new genres and new ways of interacting with the characters. Of course, if a story isn't in the public domain, then you would never try to embellish, alter, or reimagine those stories, because I mean that would be wrong, like very wrong. But the idea that stories have rigid forms that must be preserved is relatively recent, as are the concepts of rigidly enforced IP Bibles and the kind of idea of canon for fiction. Part of me can't help but wonder what the landscape would look like if we'd been a little bit looser and we didn't get so particular about what does or does not belong under a brand. But anyway, that's the world that we live in now. We can take it for granted that when children play with their toys from familiar films and games, that they can imagine their own stories. They don't just recreate the stories they know, they can use their imaginations to tell stories. But for a time, the dominant fan culture seemed resigned to the idea that stories were something to collect, not participate in. Like once you grew up, the toys belonged to the shelf in their packages, and the stories are things to, like, we value the encyclopedic knowledge of a fandom, whereas for reasons, the storytellers that wanted to create their own spins and participate with things like fan fiction were kind of shunned or pushed to the margins. But even though the dominant fandom was, we went through a long period of kind of collectors and archivists being the acceptable form. There were at least 4 billion people on Archive of Our Own alone would beg to differ that participating in fandom through creative works is essential to that discourse. Okay. Yeah, so Archive of Our Own is the largest repository of fan fiction with over 4 million users and 7 million works. 2 years ago, it won the Hugo Award and kind of got validation as an essential part of fandom. And I think in the recent years, fan fiction has kind of gone from the margins to being increasingly kind of appreciated and embraced as fandom has become more inclusive. A lot of the people who create fan fiction do so anonymously, but when we do get information about demographics, it is an audience that is overwhelmingly female and queer and people who are traditionally left out of fandom. And it's been really exciting to be a part of working in games and working in fandom as it's kind of changed from a very kind of traditional male gatekeepery world into something that's much more inclusive. And so fan fiction has been kind of at the cutting edge of that. So fan fiction, well, what is fan fiction? It's unauthorized works based on existing IP made in an amateur capacity. And so today I'm going to talk about why I think fan fiction is integral to the future of narrative and games. So fan fiction and other fan works are a modern spin on a very primal and very human tradition of playful participation in shared storytelling. It is a means of self-expression and of finding community. Fan fiction is essentially about story and play. As a narrative designer and creative director, my job is often to create the guidelines that help maintain continuity and enforce consistency in how the authorized stories are told. whether it's in a game through things like quests or in other media like novels and animation. This sort of documentation is incredibly valuable and hard to maintain, but it's essential, especially as your team grows and you need to be able to communicate and maintain consistency across media, across time zones, especially with remote work. You need to be able to understand what the core of what you're working on and maintain that consistency. Even though, and it's important for fans to think that to know that there is a plan, even though if a lot of the times it really is, we're just kind of winging it. And a lot of storytelling does happen seat of the pants and in a very improvisational fashion. But it's not a complete mess. We do have, like, that's, maintaining that core is part of the job. And I think one of the reasons why it's important that you have that plan and you have that core, having a consistent foundation is essential for fans, because then they're able to take their own unique spins and reinterpret the characters, but they still are recognizable. So whether you change the style, the time period, the context, your fellow fans kind of still know what you're talking about. So if you're working in a creative capacity and you're hearing from your fans, they want to know more of the details. They want to understand the lore and fill in some of the gaps. A lot of the times that's because they're looking for the inspiration that can take them on a new path for their own stories. Or they want to make sure that when they depict something that it will be recognized, and they don't want to try to veer too far, because being a part of the discourse with fandom is being able to share and have your work be recognized as part of a discussion and not just a totally original work. So I find it really exciting being somebody who works in a creative capacity, building these worlds, when I see fans asking to know more about the world, and seeing when they use the stories that we tell in the game and in our other products as a jumping off point to tell their own stories. I find it hugely inspiring, and that's what motivates me to continue to work in stories and games. I love to tell my own stories, but I realize that the amount of stories about the worlds and the characters that I build are so much bigger than just me or just the team I work with, just our contractors. There are hundreds or thousands of players out there who live with these characters every day, and they're telling their own stories, and I love that. So why do people create fan fiction? Well, it's the organic solution born from readers who want to spend more time with characters on their own terms. So on their own terms is really important because it's not commercial. This is something that's done intrinsically for joy, for play, and for discovery. Fan fiction is empowering. Existing as it does outside of the commercial marketplace, and with that layer of anonymity, fan fiction can offer a glimpse into the mind of the most enthusiastic fans. And we can see how it allows the reader and writer to play with taboos around identity and attraction in a safe way. It allows them to right perceived wrongs, to insert diversity into places that it's missing. It's a really profound and personal act of self-discovery, but it's also something that can be an act of generosity, because fan fiction is a way that can connect you to a larger world of fans. On Star Stable, we had a writer who went by the name Burgie on the Archive of Our Own and other fan fiction sites. And she would post a 2,000 plus word story as often as 5 times a week, where she would use requests from other fans. She would work their characters into storylines and take requests about the types of stories and types of romances and settings that players would want. She's no longer writing Star Stable fandom. She's now mostly in Final Fantasy, but it was really amazing to just see this kind of power user who comes in and creates stories so generously. And there are other people who do this, whether it's in fan art and fan fiction. So just like in UGC and games, when people make content and And whether it's mods or content that's built through the core game, there are some people are more prolific creators and some people are more consumers. And in fan fiction, it is a generous community of where people are doing this very altruistically for each other. So beyond just the personal story, it also, you can create for others, even if the other is an audience of one. And I think that's really special. And then fan fiction blurs the line between reading, writing, and role play. So I think at its core, I really believe that fan fiction is play. It's how you choose to engage with stories, absent kind of a commercial need. It's just something you have to do it. This is your way of engaging with story. And when we see like role play, tabletop, and more of the kind of performative role play of whether it's things like Critical Role or just something you do with your friends, it's clear that like tabletop is gaming. You are playing a game, but in order to engage in that, it requires it's a little bit more performative. You're real time. You have to work with others. It's a very social experience. And for some people, maybe they don't feel comfortable. Maybe like myself, you have social anxiety and sitting around and telling a story in real time. It's just not, it's not fun. It's too much stress. And fan fiction, in a way, you could say that fan fiction is like, if tabletop is real-time multiplayer, then fan fiction is a way of playing with story, kind of solo mode with privacy options. Yeah, so fan fiction is play. And I'm going to take a pause here if anybody has any questions. And when I come back, I'll talk a little bit more about ways that I think you can learn, apply lessons from fan fiction in your work in game design. So fan fiction is intensely personal to me. As a teenager, I was socially awkward, to say the least. I had pretty crippling anxiety, and I was oblivious to social cues of those around me. In middle school, I faced bullies, and I was really kind of losing hope that life would get better. Then in high school, I had moved to a new school where I had a chance to make a fresh start, and I was still anxious and awkward, but I was lucky enough to find a circle of friends with similar kind of eccentric obsessions and teachers who indulged me as I found confidence through fan works. I got through English with a Chaucer fanfic and creating my own Great Expectations role-playing game system. In AP History, I created a scripted Star Trek episode for a presentation, and they let me play out a video with action figure theater. With a friend, I collaborated on a Monty Python-inspired parody newspaper that lasted for all of one issue. With another friend, I had a weekly radio show where we'd kind of embed the school news in a scripted drama about Batman, Luke Skywalker, Jurassic Park. It was creating fan works like these, whether for myself or with a friend, or occasionally for the entire school, that gave me a new way to express my feelings when other social interactions failed. And fan fiction gave me the confidence both to survive high school and to emerge with hope and put me on a path to being a creative professional. Prior to working in the games industry, I worked in manga localization, bringing comics like Sailor Moon and Fruits Basket from Japan to America. My boss at the time was exploring how we might publish original stories based on American IP. And I suggested the movie Labyrinth. And so it's like, oh, that creepy puppet movie from the 80s with David Bowie, like, does anybody still remember that? He asked. But of course, even though this was the early era of fandom on the internet with web rings and MySpace, I knew that there was a hungry fandom, like people like me who had crushes on both of the human leads and who were still dreaming about Jareth and Sarah. And so I knew that this was a title that would have an audience. And so I kind of persuaded him. We got the license. I went out on a limb and I quit my job as an editor. And I said, I want to be a writer. So my first work as an original writer it's technically not fan fiction because it was authorized and paid. But there wasn't a brand guide and there was almost no oversight. So I was able to pretty much tell the story I wanted to tell. It was very much a work of fan fiction and kind of a dream come true for me to work with one of my heroes, with Jim Henson. And it was kind of, I recognize a kind of magic, a way of like, by participating in this kind of fan fiction type story, I'm able to play through time with another person, with another creator. And it was truly magical. And so if you've never experienced fan fiction, if for no other reason, it lets you kind of have, like, be able to have that kind of profound connection with your heroes, with your role models, with the creators and the characters that you care about most. So self-insert over. Yeah, so as someone who's working in or pursuing a career in video games, why should you care about fan fiction? Well, first of all, writing is a skill, and finishing a story with warts and all, and finding the courage to sit in front of your keyboard and write another story, that's even harder, and even when you're being paid. So if you're an aspiring writer, fan fiction can be a great way to practice your craft. Many writing opportunities involve writing for established IP. So whether it's a license like Guardians of the Galaxy or an original game IP like Horizon Zero Dawn, your employer might expect you to be able to write characters who act and sound according to brand guidelines. And especially in AAA or larger projects, writing is a team effort, and you need to be able to balance your personal voice against the needs of the project. And fan fiction is a great way to try that. If you're hiring a new writer, be open to fan fiction as part of a portfolio. Look at fan fiction the same way that you would look at a mod or something that's other forms of amateur work. It's a hugely valuable thing to measure somebody's skill, and we should totally normalize that. Just don't be that guy who says it's cringe. Like earlier this week, there was a really, there's a wonderful article on GameDeveloper.com that titled "In Defense of Fan Fiction." It's a great read with many insightful anecdotes from professionals in the game industry who participated in fan fiction on their road to becoming professional devs. And there's a good chance that many of you listening today have engaged with fan fiction, whether as a writer or a reader, and whether or not it's something you would share with a potential employer, be proud of that work. Yeah, don't be the guy who says it's cringe. Also, fan fiction is a very valuable success metric. If you're a storyteller, we're telling stories because we want to create an emotional, engaging experience for our players and our readers. So this is some fan fiction from Star Stable that's images and pairings and things that are not from the game, but it's taking aspects of the game and telling their own spin on it. So it's easier to show fan art, but we definitely have fan fiction that has similar types of stories as well. So like when you're like in Star Stable, one of the main forms of content that I work on is the quest. But when players do a quest, you're doing a quest both to get some story, but also to get some XP, to get some gold or coins, maybe get some quest rewards. It's also just you're checking off something on a checklist. There's a lot of reasons of why you do the quest. So if we're kind of looking at the data and saying, well, 97% of the people finish this quest, is it really a commentary on did the story move them? Do they like the characters? Not really. You can't really tell that from completion data. But what you can use is fan works. Are people drawing fan fiction of these characters? Are they asking questions and coming up with theories about filling in the blanks? Fan engagement and when fans take your ideas and they run with it to make their own stories is a really powerful way to know, are you onto something? Do your stories matter? Do your characters matter? Yeah, fan fiction is also fan fiction reveals the playful potential in stories that professional games often can't deliver. Fan fiction asks fans ask, and fan fiction answers questions like what if this minor character was the main character instead? What if we threw away the idea of the protagonist altogether or the plot? What if everything was the same except there are werewolves? What if we keep the dynamics, but we move everyone to the Old West? What if the real me could live in this fictional world? What if everybody here was queer? What if the friendship between these two characters was actually romantic love? Or what if instead of using swords to settle differences, they talked it out? or made out. So more and more games are starting to kind of experiment with ways to kind of blur the line between canon and playfulness. So whether it's like Fortnite skins, where you can bring different IP and mix and match within the world, or similar things like the now defunct Lego Dimensions. People are very playful about letting you use IP as a skin for conventional gameplay. Or you could take something like a very serious modern shooter and have a zombie mode, or you can take a very stoic, never smile character like Kratos and put a photo mode where he can have goofy grins. So I think that there is definitely a shift in, instead of everything has to be on book, serious, on brand all the time, to being a little bit more playful. But a lot of the constraints are still, it's focused on, we will let you change the look, but you still have to perform the standard actions of jump, shoot, kill. And there's so many things that fan fiction shows other ways that people might want to play with story that games are not often able to deliver on. Yeah, so I guess I have a few. Opening up your game to the playful approach to narrative found in fan fiction, it's definitely a tough challenge, even if you don't consider the not safe for work elements. But I do have a few tips to consider. One thing is, instead of letting a hero's journey guide your narrative, look at other kind of models of experience. Consider episodic storytelling. So instead of everything has to tie into one arc, just embrace slice of life. Take the experience one day at a time. When progression asserts itself too firmly in your narrative, sometimes playfulness can turn into work. People are so goal-oriented that they're not able to relax. But it's okay to, you should celebrate unproductive play. Let people spend time with characters. And if you're worried about people sometimes it's okay to kind of let go of achieving and problem solving and let people experience story on their own terms. There was that talk with Kim Levine about narrative Legos, and it was fine. I mean, there are ways that we can use procedural, like to craft a structured narrative, but I think the real narrative Legos potential is just let go of the rules, let people build the story they want. The solution is not a perfectly crafted story that conforms to the expectations of what a narrative should be. Let people determine that for themselves. And I think the more that we take story elements and move them from something that is authored and consumed to something that is played with, people can make things that are very personal, experience stories that are just for themselves, or something that's just for their small little circle of friends. And I think that's when things really take off and are going to be super exciting for game narrative. Yeah, so I think we should explore gameplay possibilities around relationships in more and deeper ways, like winning the friendship and getting the sex at the end, and like the gifts and the good dialogue choices in Stardew Valley and Dragon Age and games like that. That can be fun. I love games that have those kind of dating elements. But there is so much more to friendship and intimacy than accumulating points and getting the payout at the end. Like a decade later, we still talk about that Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor that created emergent drama around the theme of revenge. But what about a crush system or just yearning? Does everything have to be emotions that are focused on violence and conflict? And just a caveat here is, if you are exploring relationships and intimacy in games, you do have to go in with your eyes open that you're dealing with emotions and there is the real possibility of causing harm. So if you do choose to engage or explore emotional systems in games, do so with the understanding that you have a very high degree of responsibility to uphold your player's safety and consent. But just because something is hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And I think it's really valuable for more developers to be looking at how do we create these experiences. also like embracing agency and shaping a narrative beyond the kind of focus on choices and consequences. I think there's a lot of games, there's a discourse around, I want to make choices that matter, and I want to see the plot bend to reflect my choices as the protagonist. But there are other ways that you can shape the narrative too. I think Animal Crossing does a really phenomenal job here with the way that you can affect a villager's appearance by giving them pieces of clothing or giving them decorations for their home, or by giving them catchphrases. And so there's just little things that makes the world feel personal and feel like it belongs to you. And I think there's so much opportunity to take some of the more loose toy-like approach of like treating story as something that players can tinker with, let players adjust the setting for story. We're like getting more and more inclusive with things like difficulty setting. But I think there's opportunities like looking at something like Animal Crossing to also adjust the variables for character and story as well. Yeah, the games industry is becoming ever more sophisticated and inclusive when it comes to telling stories. So I don't want to come off saying that things are wrong or things are broken. I just think there's still so much opportunity that we're still, we have so much room to grow in terms of embracing the intersection of story and play. That I think as more and more games become open-ended platforms, I think we see people, like the idea that a game ends when you beat the story is becoming a little passé. Many games are designed like that. There's also games where it's up to the players to kind of find their fun, whether that's building their own game modes, role-playing, or creating their own memes. And I think as we kind of look at how can story be a part of that, it's going to really broaden the potential for reaching new audiences. I think there's some really great games that are kind of pushing this idea. Like I think Wildermyth is one of my favorite games of the last year, where it's a very personal narrative experience. It kind of gets rid of the idea of one protagonist, and it has an ensemble where people can die and be replaced, and just time goes on, years pass. It's a really special game that plays with narrative in ways that few games really are able to deliver on a really modest budget, and it provides these very special personal experiences that are so relatable. So I guess I'm coming to the end here. I believe that by looking at fan fiction and understanding the needs that it fulfills, that we can find new ways to broaden gaming's audience even further. So we can look at the way that players are motivated to kind of tell stories that break the fiction, but also treat fiction and treat canon as a springboard for your own ideas, your own stories. How can we support that in our games? Not necessarily to turn it into a marketplace, but as a way to just kind of hand over the keys to the story to players to make that connection to story even more personal. As a final kind of point, I wanted to look at some games are already doing this, and I think there's one game in particular that I found that I profoundly admire, and that I think it captures the spirit of fan fiction so completely, and that's 80 Days. 80 Days is a retelling of the classic Jules Verne novel Around the World in 80 Days, created as an illustrated work of interactive fiction by Inkel and writer Meg Jant. It's in true fan fiction fashion, the game casts you not as the principal protagonist, Phileas Fogg, but as his assistant, Passepartout. So just on the surface, it's already following the kind of guidelines of what you would expect from a typical fan fiction work. The setting is both familiar and new. It's a steampunk-inflected version of the Victorian era, where nations and people around the world are not subjugated colonies, but they're all distinct and thriving societies. And at first blush, a lot of these substantial twists aside, the game feels like it's going to follow a fairly conventional game structure. You have a clear goal, circumnavigating the globe in under 80 days, which is still there. And if you're so inclined, that goal can guide your choices. You can kind of play with inventory management. You can look for optimal routes. You can kind of try to manage your employer's mood, but you can also ignore the clock and the finish line altogether and just follow the threads that you find along the way. And those threads might involve swashbuckling adventures or quiet conversation or even romance. You can have both straight romance and queer romance. And ultimately, the idea of the protagonist is really subverted. You can be the hero, the one who solves the problem and wins the bet, or you can become a revolutionary, or you can just become a romantic, or you can just wander. And so just as Meg J and the Inkle team play with the source material, embellishing it, giving new relevance to an old story, they invite the audience to engage with the story in a playful way. And ultimately, that's what I hope fan fiction can inspire in you and your approach to narrative games. Like, playing through a story can be immensely satisfying, but for many creative gamers, playing with the story and adding their own voice to the dialogues, that can be even more profound. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Jake.